makers of Camel cigarettes bring the world's latest news events right into your own living room. Sit back, light up a Camel, and be an eyewitness to the happenings that made history in the last 24 hours. The Camel News Caravan presents Today's News Today. Produced for Camel Cigarettes by NBC.
Your most convenient way to buy Camels is by the carton. 10 packs of mild, flavorful Camels, ready for you to enjoy when you want them. What's worse than running out of Camels when the stores are closed or it's too late to go out? Don't let this happen to you. Buy your Camels by the carton.
Ladies and gentlemen, the story of 6-year-old Bobby Greenlease is ended. It was announced today the kidnapped boy had been found dead 55 miles from his home. He had been killed September 28th, a few hours after his abduction. This was the story a shocked nation learned today. We start the story with Jack Angel at NBC in Chicago.
This had been the beginning. The cab that came to the convent Notre Dame de Sion in Kansas City. The lady went in after him, told the nun she was his aunt, and asked to take him home to his sick mother. They left in the cab together. Out from the wooded grounds to the busy streets of town, and down a few blocks to a corner drugstore where they got out, walked a few steps to the next door parking lot, and vanished into traffic. First contact instructed the family to put the ransom money in a car, a white rag attached to the radio aerial driven down Main Street at a slow pace between 29th and 30th, a long block. But a second letter countermanded the first and enclosed the small gold medallion the child had constantly worn. Contact completed in the secluded home. But when the $600,000 ransom was tossed into a culvert Sunday night, it was already too late. There was not much left to say, except in the prayers of his first-grade classmates that remained a daily ritual through this morning. After 10 this morning, the nuns knew the truth they dared not impart to the children, and the prayers continued. The headlines were already on the presses, and an FBI agent was informing the parents. For that story, we switched to Randall Jesse at WDAF-TV in Kansas City, Missouri.
The big story in the Kansas City Star and in newspapers all across the nation tonight is that 6-year-old Bobby Greenlease, missing 10 days, has been murdered by his kidnapper. The story broke this morning about 9:30 in Kansas City, and reporters waiting at the home were summoned by Robert Lederman and Norbert O'Neill, spokesman for the family, to announce that the child's body had been found. At first, Mr. Lederman and Mr. O'Neill had said that no word had been received, but minutes later they again came to the door and asked the reporters to come to the driveway, and they then announced that the FBI had just informed the family that Bobby was dead. Reporters who had maintained a 24-hour vigil across the street from the big front mansion broke for their telephones. Within seconds, the story was flashing across the nation. 6-year-old Bobby Greenlease had been found, his body buried in a shallow grave in St. Joseph, Missouri. The first information as to the location of Bobby's grave came from Bonnie Heddy, who was picked up with the kidnapper in St. Louis. After all-night questioning, she directed authorities to the grave. The curious gathered around the white frame house, where FBI men worked at their grim task. Bobby was soon unearthed. He had been killed even before his parents had received the first ransom letter. Meanwhile, back in Kansas City, friends of the Greenlease family came to the big house on Verona Lane. For days, they had hoped and prayed with the family that little Bobby would be returned to his home without harm. But today, that dream was ended. Many wept as they left the big mansion. Bobby's mother was grief-stricken and had not been seen outside the home since his disappearance 10 days ago. From time to time, his father had been seen as he emerged from the home and drove away, or once in a great while talked to the newsman who waited across the street. But tonight, the big house is empty. The reporters are gone. The family and friends are alone, but the waiting is over, and the home in which Bobby Greenlease spent his few short years is quiet. Our story continues from St. Louis. We switch to John Rodell at KSD-TV in St. Louis.
It was here in St. Louis that the Greenlease case was broken today, and it is here, just an hour ago, that Mrs. Bonnie Brown Heddy and Carl Austin Hall were notified that they would be held under bonds of $100,000 each on a federal warrant charging extortion. It was Lieutenant Louis Shoulders of the St. Louis Police Force who got the tip that led to the arrests here. Someone told him, he won't say who, that a man staying at the exclusive West End Townhouse Apartment Hotel near Forest Park had been spending large amounts of money. Shoulders went to the hotel with Officer Elmer Dolan and there found Carl Austin Hall, 2 suitcases full of money, $293,992 to be exact, and a gun from which 3 bullets had been fired. Shoulders let reporters see the gun and the 3 empty chambers. Mrs. Bonnie Brown Heddy was later picked up at a South St. Louis apartment. Lieutenant Shoulders says his informant told him the man he suspected was in apartment 303 of the townhouse and was expecting him. Shoulders says of his informant, he said he had agreed to take a girl to the apartment and the man would not be suspicious. We were instructed to knock 3 times and call out, "Steve, this is John." Shoulders says he and Patrolman Dolan followed the instructions. The man in the apartment replied, "Okay," and opened the door. The officers placed the man under arrest, Carl Austin Hall. Both Hall and Mrs. Heddy were taken to 11th District Headquarters in St. Louis. Both were questioned from last midnight until after 8 o'clock this morning. Mrs. Heddy, a 40-year-old divorcee, admitted she was the woman who took Bobby Greenlease from the Kansas City school. She said she took the boy to Hall and left them together. When Hall rejoined her later, she said, he told her he had taken Bobby back home. Mrs. Hall explained the cuts and bruises on her face by saying Hall had beaten her. Hall told police that he had taken the boy to Thomas John Marsh. He said he later found the boy's body at St. Joseph with his gun beside it, but he said he did not kill Bobby. This is John Rodell. We switch you now to David Brinkley in the NBC newsroom in Washington.
Here in Washington, the announcement today of the break in the case came from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's director, J. Edgar Hoover. The FBI entered the case under the Lindbergh Law. Now, tonight, agents of the FBI and other law enforcement agencies throughout the country are hard after a 3rd suspect, a man accused of actually having murdered the Greenlease child. He is Thomas John Marsh, 37 years old, and he has a criminal record a yard long. He served 2 prison sentences for sordid morals offenses. He looks like this. He's 5'6", brown-haired, blue-eyed, is full of tattoos. On his right arm is a tattoo reading, "In memory of Sister, Tom Marsh." On his left arm, an anchor and a snake and a small heart tattooed on his left thumb, and his left ring finger has 1 joint missing. If you see this man, call the police. And now back to John Cameron Swayze in New York.
From the time of the kidnapping, there were reports of the child or the woman or the truck they were riding in being seen in many parts of the country. Actually, the whole story took place in a relatively small area. Now, the kidnapping occurred September 28th in Kansas City. The same day, the boy was taken to the Heddy woman's home in St. Joseph, Missouri. Sunday, October 4th, the ransom was paid on a bridge between Kansas City and St. Joseph. Last night, 2 of the kidnappers were apprehended in St. Louis. Today, back in St. Joseph, the body was found. Particular credit for coverage of this story goes to 2 newspapers and 2 television stations. The Kansas City Star and its television station WDAF-TV for breaking the story of finding the boy's body, and to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and its station KSD-TV for breaking the story of the capture of Hall and Mrs. Heddy.
The Camel Camera.
There must be a reason. What is the reason that makes Eva Gabor one of the most beautiful women in America? Is it her eyes? Or the shape of her mouth? Or her hair? Well, it's not just one feature. You've got to look at the complete picture. And now, what is it that makes Camels, the cigarette Eva Gabor smokes, America's most popular cigarette? There must be a reason. And again, it's not just one thing, it's the entire picture of smoking enjoyment.
Shall I tell you why I like Camels the best of all? First, the flavor. A flavor that you just don't find in any other cigarette. And Camel's mildness, which is always so delightful.
Yes, there is a reason for Camel's great popularity. You'll find it by smoking only Camels for 30 days. You'll see how mild, how flavorful, how enjoyable Camels are pack after pack. And you'll know why more people smoke Camels than any other cigarette.
As is always true, of course, a wide variety of other news was made around the world today, though the story we have just seen and heard claimed the headlines and most of the space. In Korea, for example, it was still touch and go at Panmunjom. Both India and the communists registered protests over the threat of the use of force by South Korean troops against the Indian troops who are serving as the guards in the neutral zone where the reluctant prisoners are being kept. These threats were actually made last week, following the killing of 3 of the prisoners during a riot by the Indian guards. And today, along with that, 63 anti-communist Chinese took off by air for Formosa, presumably to join the nationalists. Apparently they left with the blessing of South Korea, and this is very likely to be heard from in the Armistice Commission in the form of a strong protest from the communist side. In this connection, India's Prime Minister Nehru today cabled both President Eisenhower and Winston Churchill they had best use their influence to curb Sigmund-Rhee or the Korean War might be resumed. And it's understood that the United States at the United Nations later today gave assurance it would do its utmost to prevent any unexpected attack by South Korean forces on India's troops. There has been a good deal of speculation in Washington over what President Eisenhower might have to say tomorrow at his news conference regarding the hydrogen bomb, but it remains pure speculation. And it's reported unofficially tonight in London and endorsed in Paris that Winston Churchill plans a flight to Moscow for a face-to-face meeting with Russia's Malenkov if there is no top-level meeting of world heads. That's unofficial. That's the story, folks. John Cameron Swayze saying good night for Camels, America's most popular cigarette.
Important news for smokers of long cigarettes. The makers of Camels bring you extra mild, king-size Cavaliers. Feel that Cavalier mildness as you inhale. Taste that Cavalier flavor. King-size Cavaliers are priced no higher than leading regular-size brands.
The Camel News Caravan is brought to you every night, Monday through Friday, by the makers of Camel cigarettes.